Thank you for joining us once again for our 6-week Lenten series during this year of the Eucharist. And this is the fourth talk of 6. And this time I'd like to focus a little bit more specifically on the Eucharist inspires us to love one another. Some of you have heard the story it's a legend of John the Beloved Disciple. And it tells the story how they would ask for a living word for him. And so in frail health, he would walk to the top of the hill and he would look out to them and said, "My dear children, love one another." And he would go back down the hill. And he would do this frequently, like, "Can you give us a word?" And he would say, "My dear children, love one another." And he would go back down the hill. And they had finally asked, they're like, "Why do you always say again and again, love one another?" And this is what John the Beloved said. Because those words, love one another, were so often on the Master's lips. My dear little children, love one another. One of the gifts of the Eucharist is it makes us one with Jesus. More and more that we think like him, we love like him, we become one with him. And that includes, because we're drawn to communion with him, more and more we're called to love one another. That's what it means to be Eucharistic people, to care about others, to think more about others, because that's what Jesus did and he's living within us. How many parables did Jesus speak about the need to love our neighbor in concrete ways? I just focused briefly on 3 of them. There's the one, think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's the story of the man who was beaten up and left for dead on the side of the road, and the high priest goes walking by and the Pharisee goes walking by, and it was only the Samaritan that stopped, who took care of him and later came back to follow up with how he was doing. And Jesus invites us that we can't walk by the person in need. Think about the other parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Here, the rich man was living opulently, right? He had purple linens. He was living, which is very expensive linens, dining sumptuously, and yet he couldn't see poor Lazarus on his doorstep. And Jesus reminds us we can't step over or ignore the person on our doorstep. And what about Jesus' parable about the sheep and the goats? It's how we'll be judged at the end of our life. At the end of our life, we will be judged by our love. John of the Cross reminds us. And the parable of the sheep and the goats, it's those, Jesus said, as often as you did it to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. And they're all surprised. They're like, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty? When did we see you sick or a stranger? When did we see you in prison or naked or homeless?" Jesus said, as often as you did it to the least of my brothers and sisters. And also, as often as you neglected to do it to the least of my brothers and sisters. You neglected to do it to me, or you did it to me. You see this call for real concrete ways that we're called to love one another. That's really the corporal works of mercy. It's not always as dramatic as caring for someone on the side of the road or on our doorstep. Sometimes the love we're called to share, it's so much closer to home. Like we have that with those we live with. Spouses have that. Parents have that built in. I mean, talk about clothing the naked, right? That sense of making sure a coat or a hat, a child has that on. I remember a parent said it wasn't infrequent that they had their socks on, but they were missing a shoe. And it was like, well, we brought them to church anyway. We're like, yes, shoeless children are welcome at our church too. Changing diapers is a form of clothing the naked, right? How beautiful that is, and that certainly is a sacrifice as well. What about feeding the hungry? Don't count out the sacrifice of meal preparation as very pleasing to the Lord. Meal preparation for spouses, meal preparation for children, and as parents say, teenagers, they're practically always hungry. So how beautiful the sacrifices are very, very pleasing to the Lord. What about give drink to the thirsty? I remember it was just always very just special. I was with my nieces and nephews, and one of the little ones needed a drink or a cup of milk, and I'm like, I'll get it, because it would always just call to mind Jesus' words, as often as you give even a cup of cold water to one of my little ones. It's something that will never be forgotten by him. So first and foremost, love isn't just out there. It starts in there. The family is a school of love. It's a place where we learn to be selfless, to think about others, that it's not just about us. The family is exactly the school of love. but you and I know love also has to look outside of our homes. Pope Francis talked about this. This was a homily in February 12th, 2014. He talks about in the Eucharist, Christ is always renewing his gift of self, which he made on the cross. His whole life is an act of total sharing of self out of love. And then he challenges the people in Rome. He says, but the Eucharist which I celebrate, does it lead me to truly feel that they're my brothers and sisters? Does it increase my capacity to rejoice with those who rejoice and to weep with those who weep? And then he challenges, does it urge me to go out to the poor, the sick, and the marginalized? Does it help me to recognize in theirs the face of Jesus? I tell you, this is really one of the gifts that Pope Francis gives to us. He's always asking us, how are we showing compassion and tenderness to those who are in need? Don't forget the forgotten. If anybody doesn't forget the forgotten, again, God's people should never forget the forgotten. How beautiful it is. Then he ends by saying, let us ask Jesus whom we receive in the Eucharist to help us help them. Help us help them. So that's what it means ultimately to live Eucharistically. To be so one with Jesus, more and more we think about Jesus. How many people do this in very beautiful ways in our local area, that even when you're out grocery shopping at the local, whatever grocery store you go to, that how many people are actively thinking about, I'm going to get some groceries and drop it off in our food bin for the St. Vincent de Paul Society to care for local needs. Beautiful, beautiful. The Lord sees all of it and so is pleased. How many people set aside money monthly for young children in our sister parish in Haiti? Beautiful, beautiful, pleasing to the Lord. And love involves doing things we don't always feel like doing. Dorothy Day would quote the words of the Russian author Dostoevsky that says, love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared with love in dreams. And then she would go on, think of the saints. They were men and women who embodied the gospel. They didn't just talk about it in lofty language. And that's Dorothy Day of like, hey, take care of those in need. And she was all in and really inspired many, many people to true love for our neighbor. She says the saints, when they saw someone hungry, they gave them food. When they saw someone suffering, they helped them. And that's our vocation as well. I remember some time ago, I was visiting with a number of others. We were going to, it was a children's home with some pretty extreme disabilities or physical limitations. And we were going around helping different things. And I remember just thinking, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do now? And I remember walking in a room, and across the room, there was probably a 12-year-old boy with some pretty extreme physical challenges. And he was in a wheelchair, and he had, let's just put it this way, a lot of mucus coming out of his nose, so much so it was like bubbling up. And it was a lot of mucus, let's just put it that way. And I remember seeing it across the room and thinking like, I don't know, maybe I should go to another room and get snacks. Or I'm not sure I want to go over there. And I remember hearing the Lord like, go wipe his nose. You would want your nose wiped, go wipe his nose. And he was sitting over there, he was like looking over me, and I'm thinking like, I've just never seen so much, I had never seen so much on a person's nose overflowing. And I remember just hearing the Lord say, go wipe his nose. And it was an invitation. It's like, that's the love that I'm asking. That's exactly the love that I'm asking. Sometimes it's not lofty. It requires real sacrifice and real love that's gets our hands dirty even sometimes. And then whenever we speak about things like the real presence of Christ, how much should it inspire us to real presence with one another? As much as, I remember some years ago, or it was like a couple years ago, I saw an ad for virtual reality. It says, virtual reality better than reality. And I remember thinking, like, if there's anything we've learned over the last 2 years, virtual reality is not better than reality. Like, we were made to be together as best as we can and as safely as we can. And the sense of be present to one another, virtual is not enough. Mother Teresa reminded us that one of the greatest forms of poverty in the West is loneliness. Even greater than having physical needs, there's so much loneliness here. And she said we have to make sure that we visit those who are homebound or our elderly neighbors. Some people do it with making sure we spend time with grandchildren, just sitting down with them and the beautiful joy and wonder of it, and also the sacrifices of watching grandchildren at times. What about teaching faith formation, sharing the faith? It's one of the spiritual works of mercy. And yes, phone calls and Zoom calls can be good, especially if there's distance or circumstances beyond our control leads us that that's probably the best option. But all of us are called to live these works of love, the corporal works of mercy, which is feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick, and also the spiritual works of mercy. I mean, the spiritual works of mercy include to instruct the ignorant, that's teaching and sharing the faith, to counsel the doubtful. Pope Francis is always reminding us, listen to one another, accompany one another, especially in difficult times. One of the spiritual works of mercy also includes admonish sinners, to correct those who err. In other words, fraternal correction. That true love also means, there's proper correction at times, is a form of loving our neighbor. It includes, number 4, to bear wrongs patiently. That's part of what it means to love our neighbor. It doesn't mean to enable people or to kind of overlook things, but smaller things we probably can and should overlook. We all fall short in some ways. Let's keep encouraging one another. The 5th one, to forgive offenses willingly. Forgiveness is part of the love that God wants in our hearts. To comfort the afflicted, how beautiful that is in all the manifest ways of that. And to pray for the living and the dead. A little shout out to St. Monica's ministry for intercessory prayer as a form of loving. Sometimes it's a hidden form of loving, right? We're praying for a person. Sometimes we tell them, hey, I'm praying for you. Other times they may not know it until they see the Lord and ultimately the fruits of our prayer. But that also is a form of loving. Also, it struck me that when we are filled with His love, how can we not share that with others? Because every time we receive the Eucharist, right, He fills us with Eucharistic love, His presence. And then He invites us to love one another as we have been loved. And that is so, so beautiful. If you remember the story of St. Catherine Drexel, she was the millionairess, right? Drexel University was funded by her family. And yet she lived a life of simplicity and poverty, especially with the African American and Native American communities, those especially in the areas of great need. And she had a very Eucharistic sense. We draw strength from the Eucharist and we go show the love of Jesus in the Eucharist to the poorest of the poor. And here's one of her quotes. She says this: "Ours is the spirit of the Eucharist, the total gift of self." I'll repeat that. Ours is the spirit of the Eucharist, the total gift of self. So when we live the Eucharist, as Pope Benedict said, the Eucharist is a mystery to be believed, adored, and lived. And lived. Let's live it. Let's live it. Which brings us back to the beginning from the words of St. John the Beloved. My dear children, love one another. Love one another. The Eucharist, when we know how it so unites us to Him, how can we not be inspired to love our brothers and sisters in need? May God bless you.